Whether you're listening at home, at work, or anywhere, thanks for making Para-X part of your day. Your source for everything paranormal, Para-X.
And welcome back, everybody, right here to the Paranormal View on the Para-X Radio Network. I want to thank everyone for being with us tonight, those in the chat room and those listening from around the world. And speaking, if you're listening from around the world and you want to come over to the chat room, you can come over to paraxradionetwork.com and click on the chat button and follow directions into the chat room. You get a chat with all these wonderful people, chat with us, ask us questions of the guests, and I hope you have a great time. Welcome, everybody, to the Paranormal View here. We have with us Barbara Duncan. Maybe.
I'm still here.
And I believe we got Jeffrey Gould.
Yep.
And listeners from around the world. Where do we have listeners at tonight, Barbara?
Oh, speaking around the world, they're from everywhere. We don't have ET listening in, but we have pretty much all over the United States, Canada, the United Kingdom, Australia, and Poland.
All right. Poland's been here a few times.
Mm-hmm.
Welcome. I hope you enjoy the show. And we have our great guest tonight talking about UFOs, Preston Dennett.
Yes, I'm still here.
You're still here. All right. All right. I know in your book, with a lot of these stories, it's like the people didn't report at the time. It was years later that they did. But a lot of the ones that was doing the reporting at the time of the sightings, these were young kids, 5, 10 years old. And why do you think that everything waited so long before it actually got reported?
Yeah, it's very interesting. That's definitely a pattern I see in my own research and turned up in this project. A lot of people take years and years and years to talk about their sighting. I'm not sure why. I think one reason is there's a very strong ridicule factor that was certainly a lot stronger in the 60s and 70s and 80s. People really obeyed authority a lot more in the early years. There was a lot more trust in authority than I think there is perhaps today. But the truth is there's a cover-up, an enormous amount of money, a lot of time and energy. Our own tax dollars have been spent on a concerted effort from very high levels of government to make this subject look ridiculous, to make eyewitnesses appear to be liars, hoaxers, or hallucinating on drugs, mentally unstable. We see this a lot in some of the Blue Book cases where they get a good case, and what do? They attack the witness. They get a bad case, and what do? They spend all their attention on a case that's obviously Venus. This comes directly from J. Allen Hynek himself, who was part of Blue Book, the main guy, really, the astronomical consultant. So it's a real fiasco how our government has handled this, and I think that's one of the reasons that people have been so reluctant to talk about this for years, the ridicule factor. Thankfully, I think that's pretty much, not completely, but just about over. Too many really upstanding people have reported their own sightings. We know this is a real phenomenon.
Well, it always drove me nuts. There was in one of the books I read years ago, it pointed out that if you're on the stand and you give a testimony, you can put somebody in jail for life or even executed on death row, and yet the minute you say, but then there was this bright light, and I don't know what it was, like, oh, you must be crazy. Like, how does that logic follow?
Right? That's what I like these drive-in theater cases. While the testimony does in most rest on one person, a couple, a family. There's a few cases with independent witnesses, but not a lot. But if someone had actually been on the ball there, like at the terrorist drive-in, there was 30 witnesses he interviewed. There are hundreds of people seeing this thing. You can't deny it. There is absolutely no room for hoaxes, hallucinations or misperceptions in these cases.
Just
Too many
watching.
witnesses.
Now,
They're almost like each. You get these administrators saying, "When I'm president, I will, release all this stuff," and they're like, "Apparently, I can't. Sorry."
Yeah. Well, hasn't every president pretty much said a little veiled hint here or there?
Sort
Some
of,
more than others.
a little, yes, yes. Well, a lot of these sightings at the drive-ins, the drive-in a lot of times was pretty close to airports. Now, did any of the airports have radar and have a record or report of UFOs at the same time?
Not really. People have called the nearby airports who should have seen them and air bases, and they denied it. This could be just a flat-out lie, but there are some really curious cases where there were airport witnesses. Here's a case I love. It's a really interesting case. 1954, the Skyline Drive-In Theater. This is outside of St. Louis, Missouri. And this is, again, a child witness by the name of Peter. He was just a little boy when he went with his family to the drive-in. And his mom took him, his little brother. His dad couldn't go because his dad worked at the nearby airport in Lambert Field. This is actually pretty much next to the drive-in theater, just across the way a ways. And so his father was at the airport that night, and Peter is at the drive-in theater, and they're watching the movie when suddenly no one's watching the movie anymore because this UFO shows up, drops down out of the sky, and it's right next to the theater, lights up the whole area, this blood red color. It's super bright, this giant glowing fiery red oval shaped object. And he says it just hovered there for a good few minutes at the very least, long enough for people to get out of their cars and stare and wonder and gesticulate, and everyone was oohing and eyeing. A couple of people started to run towards this thing, and apparently at that point, that's when it took off at like a bullet, he said, just super fast, and it was gone. But it was a super, super dramatic event, very dramatic, he said. Afterwards, everyone was just, the conversation exploded. Well, what he didn't know was his dad was at the local airport and was watching it with other people from a much greater distance through binoculars from the control tower, actually. So this was viewed by a lot of people. Peter came from an Air Force family, had fighter pilots in his family. His dad worked at the airport, always had an interest in planes. Well, following this, he had an interest in UFOs that he never grew out of. As an adult, he followed the subject very closely, became friends with Robert Gribble, who started the National UFO Reporting Center. And one day Robert Gribble said, "You know what, I'm giving up Newfork. I'm closing it down. I can't find anyone to take over." And Peter, whose last name is Davenport, said, "I'll take it over." And that's how Peter Davenport became the director of the National UFO Reporting Center. And he says he blames it on this childhood sighting at the Skyline Theater. He says, "That's why I did it, because of that sighting."
That's wild. I think it makes me wonder if a lot of the sightings are happening now, if there was some sort of a hypnagogic fog that people seem to be in, that somehow it would dissipate after a period of time, and maybe they're starting to remember because they're no longer under some sort of influence.
Yeah, I was just studying that today, actually. I've got a YouTube channel where I put out little videos, presentations, and I'm working on one about that where, yeah, people can go. There's one case, this guy had an amazing sighting in Michigan outside of Ann Arbor with his 3 friends, and it was a very close-up sighting, 25 feet away. They watched this thing for a good number of minutes before it finally just took off, and that's all he remembers. They never talked about it. He didn't even remember it. None of them did. And they were good friends for a long time after that. He finally moved to California. And but yeah, all 4 of them apparently forgot. 30 years later, he had a high school reunion and cornered them. and one had no memory of it at all. One said, "Oh, someone played a joke on us. It was people with flashlights. Don't you remember?" And another guy said, "No, what I remember is we got out of the car. Don't you remember that?" No, the main witness did not remember that. So there's this weird amnesia factor, and sometimes it comes back 30 years later, sometimes it doesn't. So I'm thinking a lot of people have seen UFOs and don't even know it. Seriously.
Wow. So what's the most witnesses that has reported one of these sightings? I mean, where everybody, the amount of people actually reported it.
Yeah, I would say the maximum case was the one I already mentioned in China, which involved like 3,000 people. But some of these do have very, very, a lot of people at some of these theaters. The Portland Twin Theater. This is a twin theater. June 15th, 1975, Scarborough, Maine. This object slowly approaches the theater, and it's maybe 50, 75 feet overhead, and comes directly towards the theater, moves behind the screen, turns, and hovers 15 feet over it. And at this point, it causes a complete panic in the entire theater. And people drive off, speakers still attached. There's pretty much every car left except for about 10, including the main witness. And then this object moves over to, this is a twin theater. This object lifts up, goes over to the second screen, and parks over that one, and puts on a repeat performance and clears that theater out. So this happens to a lot of people. I was counting up the cases in this book, and let's just have an estimate of 100 people, 100 cases, so that's like 10,000. But you could probably times that by another 10 easily. So it's got to be somewhere between 50 and 100,000 people who have seen UFOs at drive-in theaters, just based on statistics projecting from these cases that I uncovered.
I assume
Amazing amount.
I assume that those numbers of witnesses or sightings, I should say, at the drive-ins is probably decreased, because hasn't a lot of the drive-ins closed up in the last, 10, 20 years?
Yep. Since the invention of the VCR, really. And we started doing a lot daylight savings time. That didn't help. And the technology was changing real fast. It was hard for theaters to keep up. And in the 80s, they dropped like flies. I mean, there used to be thousands of these theaters, and now there's hundreds. But they're still there. Drive-in movie theaters have a very, very loyal fan base.
And some have had a resurgence due to the virus.
Exactly. And so now we're seeing that all over the place. There's one going on here in my town, the LA Zoo. It's putting on a drive-in theater show.
Oh, wow. There's hardly any parking up by the old zoo. Oh, wait. No. You're talking the regular zoo.
Yeah.
I immediately went to the old zoo in my head. So right across from the Gene Autry Museum.
I would have to look it up. I just heard this on the news and and now I hear drive-ins, my ears always perk up. And they are definitely having a comeback. I can tell you, the 100 cases I collected, I've gotten 3 more since this book, really, and this book just came out. It's about a month old or so.
Well, I know around southwest Ohio here, I know of probably maybe 3 movie theaters that are left. And I remember that just in the town that I was raised in, there was probably 4 or 5 in itself around the area.
Yeah, they were a super successful type of company. They had a lot of things that nothing else could offer. The whole family could go. You didn't have to dress up. It wasn't overly expensive. They had all kinds of snack bars. They had live pre-shows with the stars, petting zoos. They put up playgrounds and bleachers. They had baby bottle warmers. I mean, they really went all out to attract people. Balloon rides. you name it, and it worked. People loved them for decades, and it slowly started to fade out, but still going strong, or getting stronger at least.
Wow.
Now,
So-
have you noticed or have you looked at the MUFON reports to see, have there been a resurgence over the last summer of UFO reportings around drive-in theaters?
Not over drive-in theaters, but there has been an uptick this year in the number of reported sightings, which generally seems to happen each year. There's more and more people reporting UFOs every year. So either contact is escalating, or people are getting braver about reporting their sightings, or it's getting more publicity. I think it's probably a combination of all of it.
Yeah, and probably a lot of people's not working, so maybe a lot of people is out at night more looking up at the sky too.
I am, yeah, and I did see an unexplained light. I'm serious. November 4th, I don't know what it was. It darted across the sky like 5 or 10 degrees and winked out.
Huh.
But I'm sure it wasn't a shooting star because it was just too slow. It was
Right.
just crawling. But I don't know. It was ambiguous, I guess, as you would say. Didn't see the craft with the portholes. That's what I want to see. But yeah, that's what they're doing in these theaters. I mean, honest to God. I mean, that they come so low. I mean, here's another case that just blows my mind. June 29th, 1964. This is in Atlanta, Georgia. A guy had gone to the theater with his family, his extended family, and he was just a kid, so he's on the bleachers with his cousins. His parents are in the car when suddenly one of the kids shouts out, "Hey, look, everyone, UFO!" And sure enough, it's a classic flying saucer. It's a couple of 100 yards away going over the tree line. And just meanders by and goes off into the distance. And no one seems to care. No one seems to react. No one does anything. They would just turn back and watch the movie for a few more minutes when the same kid shouts out, "There it is again!" And this time it's making a beeline for the theater. It's coming directly towards them at a very low level, 100 feet up about, a couple of hundred, maybe higher, maybe lower, and comes right over the bleachers, actually. And the main witness says every single kid ran in a complete panic. It cleared those bleachers out 100%. He and his cousin went straight to the snack bar and went inside there undercover to hide from it. And everyone's panicking. There's everyone running in every which direction. Cars are screeching out. Finally, he gets the courage to look out, creep outside and see where this object is. It's directly overhead, right over the snack bar. So they run for the car. They find their parents, and this object, does finally move off. But by that point, the theater is pretty much cleared out.
Wow.
They were trying to get a discount on their burger or hot dog or something.
Yeah, they just wanted some popcorn. Come on.
Now, I know on page 91, the Heinzville Drive-In, Georgia, were there any other reports of this particular abduction? Because it was supposedly an abduction.
Yeah, this is a strange case, and the only one really like it. No, I couldn't. The Ascot Park Drive-In, I wonder, because he had basically missing time or amnesia of the event. And whenever we see amnesia of an event, to me, that's a definite possibility that an abduction took place. But the events at the Heinzville Drive-In in 1974, Georgia, no, this is unique. I found one case like it. They were at this theater, something they did regularly. Never saw anything like this. They kind of simultaneously noticed a husband and wife. The man, his name is Derek Smith. He's an Army Ranger, a good witness, trained observer. They see this disc, this glowing disc of light, and it's sending down a beam. It's at a pretty low level, treetop level. It sends down this kind of coherent, opaque beam of light, which separates from the craft itself, but still remains in the sky. So this is not a normal light by any means. We can't do this with our light beams. And it just slowly goes towards the ground and then starts coming back up. This time there's a figure in it, a human figure or human looking. It's got arms and legs and a head, and it's tumbling around, kind of out of control almost, and just goes right up into this craft, which scoots away. And they're both looking at it going, oh my God, do you see this? Do you see this? And no one else at the theater apparently saw this. And this is another weird thing that turns up. In almost every case, everyone can see these objects, but in a few, no. Everyone should be able to see it, but no one's reacting. It's very weird.
Well, now,
so they leave the theater, and they actually go looking for this thing, but never found it.
Was this abduction of a person from the theater, or maybe outside the theater, and they just seen it come down, go up thing?
Yeah, it was outside the theater.
Okay.
But not far away. No, apparently it was not at the theater itself.
So it could have been somebody who was on their own or by themselves or something like that, to where there wouldn't have been anybody right in that vicinity as a witness of them abducting him.
Right. But what I'd like to see is, like, if one of these people who had one of the amnesia events at these drive-ins were to go under hypnosis, what would they recall? Would they recall 300 people being herded aboard a UFO? And who knows? I mean, that would be amazing. I mean, I just can't even imagine. In a way, it wouldn't surprise me, though, because there are mass abductions that we know about.
Huh.
So are you thinking that perhaps the people that didn't see the spacecraft were the ones that were abducted, or just had a post-hypnotic suggestion saying you're not going to remember it?
Or it was blocked from them. Because there's this weird ability that UFOs have. And I've seen this, I mean, I haven't seen it demonstrated, but people have told me that they've seen this, where a UFO can show itself to one person in a crowd, or two, or three.
Huh.
There's one kid, I didn't get to interview him directly. He was a friend of my nephew's. And there was 4 teenagers, and one of them starts shouting up and down, like, look, the flying saucer. And all 3 of his friends just looked at him like he's out of his mind. But it was right there, in full view, and he tried to, have his friends look where he was looking, and they're moving around looking. 'Cause sometimes they do appear in this little space, kind of a little window almost. Whitley Strieber reported that if you moved your head 1 inch to the left or right, you wouldn't see it. But no, that's apparently not what was happening here. They were just showing themselves to this one guy. And I've got other cases exactly like that. From a Navy medic, he reported that. He was on a ship. Only he could see the UFO. No one else could see it. Yeah, that's weird. So I think sometimes it is mental, or sometimes it's just a device, mechanical.
Well, other than drive-ins, is there another location that has had sightings and reports of something like this?
Not really. I mean, there is and there isn't. I certainly dug deep looking for it, and I did find a couple over sports events and a couple over concerts, but just a couple. The only thing I found that is at all similar, and is actually strikingly similar, would be the Schoolyard Encounters. And a Schoolyard Encounter is when these objects hover over a schoolyard, usually at recess, but not always, or lunchtime or whatever, and show themselves off to a fairly large group of children, 50, 100, 400 in one case. Usually children, very young elementary age. Half the cases involve elementary schools, but the other half are junior high, high school, and colleges. And often teachers are there. And it's very similar because, again, we have this behavior where the school is targeted. Again, these are very low-level sightings, usually 50 to 100 feet, 300. Often these are very long-lasting, sometimes hours, sometimes days in some of the schoolyard cases. And, yeah, these displays. So that would be the only thing I could really point to that's very similar. But yeah, there are all kinds of UFO attractors. Graveyards, by the way, I bet is something UFOs are strangely and weirdly and kind of creepily attracted to.
Really? I hadn't heard of these.
Yes, and I had to do a whole survey of the literature, and this is absolutely a thing. Cases from J. Allen Hynek, cases from Raymond Fowler, cases from UFO researchers across the world. I've found a good 20 or 30 cases, and these aren't just sightings. These are very low-level sightings. They're shining their beams of light on graves. Some of these graves are being disturbed. There's landings. There's humanoids being seen. There is something going on here, and it's not super well known. But Scott Corrales, he knows about it. He got a bunch of cases. So I'm not sure what's going on there. Alien grave robbers, genetics has always been their thing.
Well, that was the premise of Plan 9 from Outer Space.
Right? But, Scott Corrales is like, well, maybe they're getting implants, retrieving implants. Someone's like, well, maybe they're taking people's souls. I'm like, oh, God. I hope not. I mean, I don't know. Another person's like, well, they're just studying our death rituals. They're just curious. But what really strikes me is how low level these cases are, and how they're shining down beams of light, disturbing some of these graves. One graveyard was repeatedly visited so often, the Nethkin graveyard, the Dean Memorial Cemetery in West Virginia, that the whole town knew about it. Everyone had seen it, and people would go there for UFO stakeouts regularly and watch these things. And they could predict it because, whenever there was a new grave, they're like, well, probably going to be coming. Sure enough.
There goes Floyd.
Huh.
Hey, there's actually someone named Floyd there, by the way.
Oh.
That's kind of creepy. Psychic.
But you're also bringing up a good point, too, especially with some of these incidents as you're describing with the spacecraft being so low, is that if they are responsible for crop circles, then it's not, the crop circles aren't an effect of their shipped power, or however they're driving it, but it's an intentional act, an intentional beam.
Yeah, the crop circles are really interesting, aren't they? People have not, at least not to my satisfaction, been able to directly tie this to the UFO phenomena. Wouldn't surprise me a bit if it is aliens as we would think of them. But there's a big umbrella of phenomena, and we've got near-death experiences, we've got Bigfoot, all kinds of cryptozoological creatures, we've got angels. The evidence for angels is pretty compelling. Spirits, trickster spirits. Some people think UFOs are demonic. I don't, but there are interdimensional beings. There's earth beings, nature spirits. The whole fairy lore of the 1800s has got some really difficult to dismiss accounts. So we have to be really careful labeling this phenomena. Crop circles are definitely intentional. That's another thing that's obviously wants to be seen. I don't think it's Doug and Dave or any humans doing this. Far too many, far too complex. Yes, a person can easily build a crop circle, but Dr. Levengood has been able to prove that some of these are genuine because the nodes in these wheat stalks have been burst by some type of radiation that you can't fake. And there's all kinds of mathematical equations coming out in these things, the Mandelbrot set, and all kinds of, the Fibonacci sequence, and these really profound messages. I love them. I think they're great, and I really want to know who's doing them and what the real purpose is. But I think it's sort of to make people question and raise their awareness, which is definitely something we see in UFO encounters as well.
Yeah. Have there been any sort of markings in the recent drive-in sightings that were indicators that a spacecraft had been there?
No, we have really no landing cases in these drive-ins. They will come down to a few feet off the ground. I mean, there was one case where these things came swooping down to about 2 feet, people were estimating. So that's just wild. But no actual cases of landing that we know of. but they will hover right over a tree, 10, 15, 50 feet over the screen itself, or to the right of the screen, or to the left, below the top of the screen. So very, very low level, but no physical evidence of landing traces or radiation. The best we have of that is, the handful of cases where the screen suddenly gets all distorted, and then the object moves off, or the screen goes out. There's a couple of cases where it caused a blackout completely. They had to send the kids home.
So no burn marks, no.
Oh well, there's
nothing.
Actually, there's one case, one possible case of physiological effects where I had to include it, even though it was not a whole lot of information on it, because it had this weird aspect. Yeah, this UFO hovered over the theater, and the main witness was this lady, and she was 6 months pregnant at the time. And the sighting freaked her out because it was so close. And she had her baby, and it was, just, let's see, 4 months, 5 months later, baby's just a couple of months old. And she said she would feel this weird buzzing coming from his skin. And when this started happening, she thought it was unexplained and unusual, and instantly connected it to this object that had hovered over the theater, and kept thinking intuitively, for some weird reason, that it had buzzed, or beamed actually, something into her stomach. That's a direct quote. It beamed something into my stomach. And when she said that, I'm like, oh, okay. Because I have a lot of cases where these objects, these ETs, will show up when a woman is 9 months pregnant, 8 months pregnant, or just had their baby. Over and over and over and over again, I see this. It's an interest in reproduction. And I'm wondering in this case if, like the witness says, something happened. I don't know.
Did you ever try and get in touch with her to see if anything has happened since she's had the baby?
No, unfortunately, I couldn't. The vast majority of these cases are from newspaper articles, or they're posted anonymously to National UFO Reporting Center, or were reported to APRO, Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, MUFON. Most of them I was not able to track personally. A small handful I was. And talking to the first-hand witness is always great. But no, could not in that case, unfortunately. But I am getting more reports now. And one person said, what you should do is start calling up the theaters themselves, the owners. And I'm like, shucks, I never even thought of that. Shoot, let's call these guys up. Because I bet you if I were to do that, these guys are like, you won't believe it. They show up like 20 times. I would have another book.
Probably.
So that's something I really should do. So I'm looking into that, right?
Well, now, were there witnesses of these UFOs that were not at the movie theater, but blocks or miles away and reported seeing the UFOs also?
Yes. Yeah, that does periodically turn up in a handful of cases. One Air Force officer reported seeing the UFO from his home and saw that it was hovering over the theater. And sometimes people will be driving home and they're like, I saw a UFO. And they talk to someone else. Oh, it came over the theater. You didn't see it. Everyone was there. So they see it either going to the theater or leaving the theater is my guess. But in most cases, it's targeting the theater. I mean, how I discovered it was targeting theaters is I was writing a series of books about UFOs over various states, and occasionally I kept hitting these drive-in theater encounters. And I'm writing UFOs over Colorado, and I hit 3 in a row. And I'm like, oh my gosh, this is a thing. And in one of these cases, this object was just out there and off in the distance in this meandering course, just kind of doodling around, and suddenly sees the theater, and that's when it stops going back and forth and makes a straight line and goes right towards the theater and flashes its lights at the audience, who in turn turn on their lights, by the way, and honk their horns. So in some cases, that's exactly what happens. There's this little communication to a certain extent. So I guess there is. You asked about that. People will flash their lights and the UFO flashes back. It doesn't happen often, but it happened in that case. And yeah, in another Colorado case, it came right down, flashed the lights so bright people couldn't even look at it. And they flashed back and it took off.
Huh.
Oh, that's shades of Close Encounters.
Right? Yeah.
Well, it kind of makes you, wonder if they're trying to, if they could communicate that way.
Yeah. Some people, a lot of these cases, people have never seen a UFO before, and I'm wondering if it comes over their screen and they're thinking, wow, the effects are really good in this movie. It's like 3D. And some people have been told, oh, what you saw was an advertising balloon, which they vehemently deny. But that's what sometimes happens when they call the police. Like, oh, it's just the Champ's chicken balloon, or something like that.
Wow.
So do you find that a lot of these reports do get left off by local law enforcement, that they simply just don't want to, they either don't want to be bothered with it or they really don't want to investigate?
For sure. Absolutely. The ones that do make it through, a lot of them were because there was a military witness and the press got a hold of it, and the press likes, a person of military background, a trained observer. But yeah, most of these go unreported. Like the one I told you about, the South Hutch drive-in, where it circled the theater and everyone chased after it. Great case. Well, a bunch of people went to the newspaper. There's a local paper there. And Pat didn't go to the newspaper because he heard that other people went, and he just wanted to read the story that was supposed to come out the next day, which didn't come out. No surprise, didn't come out the next day after. So he decides he is going to go to the newspaper. He had done photography work for them. He knew them. Goes to the theater, the newspaper's office with his friend who saw the movie, and they're like, hey, we were also at the drive-in 3 nights ago. We saw it. Have you heard about this? And the people at the newspaper office denied it. They said, no, we haven't heard. And no, we're not interested. So they played dumb and brushed them off.
Huh.
And Pat knew that this was wrong, incorrect, because rumors started flying around town. He asked around, and everyone's like, oh, yeah, military showed up, quashed the story, wouldn't let him report.
Huh.
And we know the military is interested in this case because in a number of these cases, it goes straight up to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, which is UFO Central. They know. They know from the very beginning. They're hovering over theaters and completely deny it and won't talk about it and call us liars.
Yeah. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base is, I'd say probably closer than 50 miles to me, because I live in Eaton, which is about 22 miles from Dayton. And so I know it's still pretty close. I think it's on the eastern side of Dayton. So that's about, probably about, I'd say 25, 35 miles from where I live.
Yeah, lots of encounters in Ohio, lots of drive-in encounters in Ohio. Southside Drive-In Theater, Youngstown, Ohio, 200 witnesses. A large object darts around above the theater for so long it stole the show. And people weren't watching the movie anymore. And a bunch of people got freaked out.
Yeah. Well, the earliest drive-in encounter that you got in the book was July 22nd, 1950 in Spartanburg, South Carolina.
Yeah, that's the earliest one I could find, the Starlight Drive-In Theater. Starlight is the most common drive-in theater name, and there's at least 3 or 4 theaters named Starlight that were visited by UFOs. And this is a good example of, how did this case possibly get through any publicity? The main witness was Vernon Gwynn. He's a journalist, and a good observer. And he saw this UFO with his wife. It looked like this weird cloud-like object at first, but it kept buzzing the theater. Burst once, then again, a third time, fourth time it came really close. They could see it was metallic, had a round bottom. Other people next to them saw it as well. It was silvery or white, very large, very low. And he called up the newspaper. and it was reported to Project Blue Book. They wrote a big report on it. And this was forwarded to Colonel John Meads, at the commanding general at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. So yeah, they knew about this from the very beginning, and paid very close attention to reports from military officers in particular.
Wow.
Well, 1947, that would have been probably one of the first drive-in theaters, right?
1947, Roswell, the Kenneth Arnold sighting. That's the modern age of UFOs. That's when it began. And that's what we're seeing here with the drive-in theaters. It's
So do we know who opened the first drive-in theater anywhere? The concept.
Oh,
Because
yeah.
Talkies would have been. Yeah.
Well, that was
Yeah.
1925.
Yeah, I put it in the book. I forget, it was like the first theater to open up. It actually didn't do that well, and it ended up
Losing money?
being resold, losing money, and finally just closed down.
Well, it was such a new concept. People were like, "Are they kidding? What kind of nonsense is this?"
Yeah. But it slowly became very popular, for sure.
Oh yeah. Not only for date night, but even family nights. Because we used to, my parents and my brother and I would go to the drive-in all the time. They'd have the family show, which sometimes would be a Disney feature, one of the old early Kurt Russell college series. And then you'd have the adult movie that the kids would be, go to sleep in the back, in theory.
Yeah, well, here it is. Okay, 1915, world's first public drive-in theater.
Wow.
15, even before talkies.
So that's where they were watching outdoor movies. The first actual one opened up in June of 1933.
Oh, okay.
But it never made a profit, closed down 3 years later. The second oldest, Shankweiler's, was opened in 1934, and it's actually still in operation.
Wow.
But yeah, it's funny, in the 50s, they were super popular. In the 60s, they started to get in trouble, and the media called them passion pits because young couples had discovered a place to go to.
Yeah.
And what happened is the police started the theater owners hired police officers with flashlights, and they would walk up and down the aisles looking for, young teenagers smooching. But by the 70s, a lot of these theaters had converted to only adult movies and were showing X-rated films.
Really? Wow.
So
Goodness.
it turned out to be a really good venue for that. So, ironically enough. So maybe that
makes some money while the hay shines.
But they're making a comeback, and I'm glad. And I think we're going to see more of these cases.
I don't know if you remember, there was a drive-in theater on Roscoe, right near Van Nuys Boulevard for a time. When I first moved out here, I lived in North Hills with my girlfriend's friend, and I thought, oh my God, there's a drive-in theater. How awesome is that? And it was the last season.
No.
It closed down and it was gone. I was like, oh man.
Wow.
Yeah. They're few and far between, but we'll see. We'll see if they make a true comeback. I don't think they're going away. I really don't. People like them. They have a loyal audience.
Well, you have to look at it like this. With COVID, people would rather go to a drive-in and be in their own car instead of sitting in a movie theater with 100 other people that's not wearing masks or might be sick or whatever.
Yep. It's not quite the same as an indoor theater, but it does provide that added attraction that a UFO might show up.
Well,
Yeah,
true,
mosquitoes.
true.
Oh wait, no.
But we used to, fix a big bag of popcorn and take a cooler with our own drinks and sit there and have a good time at the movies.
Yeah, I loved it. We had a huge family. There were 6 kids in our family. It's, always there was someone hiding under the seat to save $1.
Yeah, depending on what kind of movie it is, hide your eyes. This is the scary part.
Yeah, I miss the drive-ins for sure.
Yeah. Well, we still got we got 1 or 2 still open around our area, so we can still go to one. I don't know if they're open now with COVID or not, but when it's open, you can still go there. So.
Well,
Yeah.
I think the very first film I saw at a drive-in theater was, which one was it? Midnight Cowboy and Alice's Restaurant.
Really?
Oh wow, that's a double feature and a half.
Yeah, no, it was awesome. So, without asking, Preston, what was your favorite drive-in theater and movie?
I think I saw Chitty Chitty Bang Bang. I think that might have been my first one.
Really?
Oh, wow.
Yeah. Yeah, I remember we used to go to them fairly regularly. It was fun. I loved it. We all bring our pillows and just lay out, and we had a microbus, and we could all get out our lawn chairs and stuff. But
That's
now
how we used the Volkswagen bus. Yeah.
the speakers were terrible.
Oh,
These
some
tinny
of them
little.
were, yeah.
It was like might as
Now-
well be over a telephone.
Now
A
they,
landline
But you
telephone.
never saw a UFO.
No, I didn't. But I've already talked with some people who found out about my book and are like, "Oh my gosh, this happened to me." I'm like, "Really? I just knew it."
Huh.
And they describe exactly the same type of behavior. There's like 3 or 4 earmarked behaviors I look for in these cases.
Wow.
It's got to be low level, over right up above the screen or
Right
to
to
the
the
right or the left. It's got to be fairly long lasting, and there's usually some sort of movement where they'll eject a smaller ship, or they'll dart around, they'll pull a U-turn or right angle, they'll go around the theater itself, or they'll flare up their lights. They do something to say hi, essentially.
Now, one of the ones that I remember seeing at the drive-in was Teenagers from Outer Space.
Well, yeah.
Yeah.
That's just a screen memory.
Yeah.
That's
Yes.
just, that was
The
probably not.
teenagers that were actually 40. Yeah.
You shall be brought back to home for torture. Classic line. Classic.
Yeah, I was hoping that some of these UFOs would show up during, like, the day the Earth stood still, or aliens. But no, I don't have any cases like that. Closest is perhaps Beyond and Back, about near-death experiences,
Wow.
or one with Jurassic Park, King Kong, the Simpsons movie. I think that has a UFO in it.
Would you think that maybe there was something else in the area as to why they might be around and see the movie theaters, such as maybe a nuclear power plant or military base or something like that?
I looked into it, and there was only maybe 3 or 4 cases where that fit. Airports do seem to attract UFOs, and there was, Peter Davenport's case. There's one case at the 3-way drive-in in Clifton, Arizona, and that turns out to be a mining town. And there's a bunch of sightings over these mines in Arizona. It's crazy, over the copper mines there. So I think that could have been a factor. Yuma Drive-In in Yuma, Arizona has been visited multiple times over decades.
Wow.
There is an Air Force base near there. But I don't know. They come right next to the screen. So it's clear what, is attracting them is us or the movie.
Oh,
Just really wild.
yep, sure is.
It's really cool. What I'm waiting for is one to just show up and put on a movie. Send down the beam of light and put on their own movie.
Show us what one of your movies look like from your planet.
Now,
Next up from Krell Productions.
A new one for the Hollywood Foreign Press will be Hollywood Alien Press.
Straight from the planet Crouton. Yeah. I would love that. Can you imagine the news story on that? Wow.
Nibiru, a love story.
All
So
right.
who knows? Who knows? There are strange effects, but it's not going to end. UFOs are not going away. They're here for good. We're coming closer. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think eventually we're going to have to know that they've already talked to our government. I mean, they've got to release stuff like that. I can't understand, though, with everything going on in the world, why they haven't intervened or why it hasn't actually come out that our governments are in contact with them.
Yeah, there's been a lot of high-level disclosures. There are presidents who've seen UFOs, senators, representatives, governors, very high generals, commanders. There's been a lot of disclosure, but it's very piecemeal, very step by step, drip by drip, very tightly controlled. We'll see.
All right, our time is just shot right on by.
Wasting time.
Yeah,
Okay.
Barbara, you got any quick thing to ask or anything before we get ready to
Well,
shut
no,
down?
not that will take us another 2
Oh.
hours.
Oh. All right.
We
then.
didn't even get into the out-of-body experience talk.
Oh,
We got to talk about that. Yeah.
yeah, we'll get into that
Well,
then.
yeah,
Maybe
but-
we'll set something up for that. How's that sound?
Yeah, I'd love that. Love that
Great.
subject.
Preston, I want to thank you for being with us again tonight. I want you to let everybody know how they can follow you, where they can get your books at, because you've got, I don't know how many, hundreds of books that you've written?
A lot.
A lot, yeah. So,
And the YouTube channel.
Yeah, I got to find that. Yeah.
and
Good.
then we want you to stay on until after we're off, and we'll thank you again.
All right. Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I've written about 100 articles, by the way, over 100. About almost 30 books. You can find out about them at my website, prestondennett.weebly.com. If you Google my name, it should take you right there. I do have a YouTube channel. Just, again, type in my name, it should take you there. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I'm trying to get more socially...
Is it just me or is your Twitter just have... You're on Instagram too, but you have no posts yet, right? Kind of.
I'm working on it. I'm not super computer literate. I come from the drive-in theater era.
Well, so do I. I mean,
All right. I want to thank you again. And next week we have author Kendra Payne, who's written Haunted Creed, Colorado. That's where it's located. It goes back into the mid 1800s. It was an old silver boom town, and lots of history and lots of killings go on there, and ghosts. So join us next week for that then. With that, this is Henry Foister,
Jeffrey Gould.
I'm Barbara Duncan.
and we will see you people next week at the same time. So good night, everybody. You've been listening to the Paranormal View on the ParaX Radio Network. Join us again next week at the same time for more of the Paranormal